This story is titled, My Dad Tried to Force Me Out of My Own House for My Pregnant Stepsister. This time, I stood up to him. Hi, everyone. Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and make sure you never miss out on amazing videos. All right, let's get started. Hey guys, so here's the rundown because I honestly need to vent somewhere, and this feels like the safest place. I'm 31, single, and finally in a good spot. I've worked my tail off to get where I am. Bought my first house last year, which was a huge deal for me. It's nothing extravagant, just a modest 3-bedroom with a little backyard, but I'm proud of it. For once in my life, I feel like I've got things under control. Unfortunately, life's a lot less peaceful when you have a family like mine. Let's start with my dad. I've always thought of him as a part-time parent. He's 62 now, remarried, and has spent most of my life either ignoring me or complaining about something. He's the kind of guy who thinks writing a birthday card every few counts as quality parenting. When my mom died in a car accident when I was 5, he remarried Sharon almost immediately, like 2 months later. It's almost impressive how quickly he moved on. Though impressive isn't the word I'd usually use for it. Sharon, my stepmom, is a real piece of work. She's 58 now, but she's the type of person who still acts like she's 30. Botox, fake nails that could double as weapons, hair extensions, and a personality that could peel paint off the walls. Back in the day, she was a flight attendant, and she won't let anyone forget it. Every time she opens her mouth, it's, "When I used to fly internationally," or "Back in the golden age of flying." We get it, Sharon. You served drinks at 30,000 feet. Now she runs a daycare, which is wild to me because she barely managed to raise her own kid. That brings us to Brittany. She's 29 and technically my half-sister, though we're about as close as two strangers in a checkout line. She's Sharon's daughter from a previous relationship, but my dad's treated her like his golden child since day one. She's the family's pride and joy, though I'd argue that's more about my dad and Sharon being delusional than anything Brittany's actually done. She's made some unique career choices. She works as an escort, which is fine. It's her life. She also has an OnlyFans account. The only problem? She's terrible at it. Brittany's always broke, which tells me her business isn't exactly booming. I found out about it when a friend of mine awkwardly showed me her profile after she hit him up, not realizing we were related. Imagine how much fun that conversation was. However, my dad calls her his pride and joy, completely oblivious to what she actually does for a living. Now, I'm not super conservative, but I do have my principles and I'm focused on my career. I date when I have time trying to get to know women properly. Growing up, Brittany was the princess of the house, and I was the extra. I lived with them until I was 8, which is when Sharon famously said, "I'm not raising someone else's spoiled kid." Spoiled? Me? I didn't even have a bike because my dad forgot to get me one for Christmas. Anyway, that's when they decided boarding school was the answer. Sharon could have her perfect little family without me in the way, and my dad could pat himself on the back for providing a better education. In reality, it was just their way of dumping me somewhere far away so they wouldn't have to deal with me. My mom, though, she was different. She genuinely cared about me, and losing her was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. She was late picking me up from school one day, which was completely out of character, and I remember sitting on the curb, waiting. Turns out, a guy ran a red light and hit her car at an intersection. She died on the spot. The guy walked away with a broken arm. I'll never forget how my dad showed up at school hours later, looking annoyed, like I was inconveniencing him. Sharon was with him, and her first words were, "Your kid, your problem. Don't expect me to take care of him." Even at 5, I could tell she wasn't joking. They didn't waste any time shipping me off to boarding school after that. Fast forward to now. I've worked hard to build a life for myself. I went to college, got a decent job, and saved every penny I could. I skipped vacations, lived in a tiny apartment with questionable plumbing for years, and finally bought my house last year. It's the first thing I've ever owned that feels like it's truly mine. My dad? He didn't even say congratulations. When I told him about the house, his only response was, "Oh, must be nice." You can practically hear the jealousy dripping off his words. For a while, I kept my distance from them. I mean, why wouldn't I? They've never really been supportive or even kind. But when I bought the house, I thought maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. I figured I'd invite them over for a housewarming party, show them that I've done okay for myself, and maybe get a tiny bit of acknowledgement. Stupid, I know. But sometimes hope makes you do dumb things. So, against my better judgment, I invited my dad, Sharon, and Brittany to the housewarming party. I thought it might be a good way to mend fences, or at least keep things civil. Looking back, I don't know what I was thinking. These people don't do civil. They do drama, and they do it well. But hey, I guess I thought they might surprise me. And that's how I set the stage for the disaster that's about to unfold. If I'd known what was coming, I would have saved myself the trouble and just sent them a postcard with a picture of the house. The day of the housewarming, I woke up early to get everything ready. Cleaning, organizing, setting up snacks. It was a whole production. I even went out of my way to make sure there were things everyone would like, which was honestly more effort than my dad or Sharon ever put into anything for me. My playlist was carefully curated because nothing says awkward like dead silence at a family gathering. By the time I was done, the place looked great, if I do say so myself. They showed up an hour late because of course they did. Sharon was the first one through the door, her heels clacking loudly on the hardwood like she was making an entrance at a gala. She stopped in the entryway and scanned the room, her face twisted into that familiar, not impressed expression. "Well, this is cozy," she said, stretching out the word like she was searching for a polite way to say small. Then she added, "It's fine for someone single, I guess." Behind her came my dad, hands in his pockets, and looking like he was doing me a favor by showing up. He barely glanced around before saying, "You didn't tell me you were looking for a house. You could have asked for my advice. I know a thing or two about investments." Right? Because the guy who let Sharon handle the family finances like it was monopoly money is definitely someone I'd trust for financial advice. Last, dragging her feet like a kid forced to visit relatives, was Brittany. She muttered "nice place" without even looking up from her phone. I doubt she meant it. Knowing her, she was probably too busy checking her social media to care. Once they settled in, the critiques started rolling in. Like clockwork. Sharon zeroed in on my furniture. "Why did you pick such a dark couch? It makes the room feel heavy. You should have gone for something lighter, more inviting." Then she glanced at the curtains. "Oh, honey, no. These aren't working at all. Maybe I'll help you redecorate. This place could really use a woman's touch." "Oh, how generous of you, Sharon. I'll be sure to let you know when I want my house to look like your daycare/gossip hub." My dad, not to be outdone, decided to focus on my finances. "You didn't mention how much this place cost," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Are you sure the mortgage isn't too much for you? Houses are expensive, you know." "Thanks for the reminder, Dad. I'm so glad I have your wisdom to guide me." Meanwhile, Brittany planted herself in a corner with a soda, scrolling through her phone and snapping the occasional selfie. At one point, I heard her tell someone in her comments, "Yeah, I'm at my stepbrother's housewarming. It's nothing impressive." Despite their collective efforts to turn the night into a critique session, I powered through. I played the good host, kept the snacks flowing, and did my best to keep things light. But the longer they stayed, the harder it got to keep my patience in check. Sharon made a point of telling me how much better the kitchen would look with a pop of color. My dad found a way to tie every compliment back to himself. Brittany barely acknowledged me, which at that point felt more like a blessing than an insult. The final straw came when Sharon decided to offer her unsolicited thoughts on my choice of neighborhood. "It's fine," she said, in that fake nice tone she uses when she's trying to sound supportive, but really isn't. "It's not where I would have chosen, but, you know, for a first house, it's adequate." Adequate. Because nothing says congratulations like calling someone's biggest accomplishment adequate. By the time they left, I was exhausted. Sharon gave me one of those fake hugs where she barely touched me and said, "Well, at least you're trying." Brittany just walked out without saying goodbye, still glued to her phone. My dad lingered for a moment, like he wanted to say something, but then he just nodded and left. I thought that was it. I figured I'd done my duty as the black sheep of the family and could go back to enjoying my hard-earned peace and quiet. But no. A week later, my dad called. "We need to talk," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Okay, what's up?" I asked, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense he was about to drop. "Not over the phone. Can you come home tonight? It's important." He didn't even ask if I was busy or had plans. Just expected me to drop everything and show up like I owed him something. I wanted to say no. I really did. But something about the tone of his voice made me curious. Maybe it was serious. Maybe he actually needed my help for once instead of the other way around. So, against my better judgment, I said, "Sure," and hung up. The drive to their house felt longer than usual, probably because I was dreading whatever important thing he had to tell me. Their house hasn't changed much over the year. Outdated, slightly run down, and stuffed with Sharon's tacky decoration. Every time I see those plastic flamingos in the yard, I'm reminded of why I never visit. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a minute, trying to psych myself up. Walking into that house is always weird. Technically, it's my childhood home, but it's never really felt like mine. After my mom died, Sharon made sure to erase every trace of her. Her knickknacks, her pictures, her art, gone, replaced with Sharon's overpriced junk and gaudy furniture. Even as a kid, I felt like a guest in my own house. When I finally walked in, the atmosphere was off. Sharon and Brittany were sitting on the couch, both looking tense. Sharon had that pinched expression she gets when she's about to unload some unwanted advice, and Brittany was half paying attention, still scrolling on her phone. My dad was pacing in the kitchen, muttering to himself like he was rehearsing a speech. The whole vibe felt off. like I'd walked into a courtroom and didn't know I was the defendant. "What's going on?" I asked, shutting the door behind me. "Sit down," my dad said, motioning to the chair across from Sharon and Brittany. I sat down across from Sharon and Brittany, who were clearly trying to look like this was some sort of serious family meeting. Sharon had that fake, concerned look she always pulls out when she's about to say something self-serving. And Brittany, for once, wasn't glued to her phone. She just stared at the floor, sniffling dramatically. "Are you blind?" my dad snapped the moment I sat down. No warm-up, no small talk, just straight to the accusation. I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" He didn't wait for me to elaborate. I said, "Are you blind? Or do you just choose not to see what's happening around you? Because the way I see it, you've gotten too proud with this new house of yours, acting like you're too good for the rest of us, ignoring the people who actually mean something." There it was, the guilt trip. I leaned back in the chair, crossing my arms. "Oh, I'm sorry. I must have missed all those years you meant something when you sent me off to boarding school. My bad." That didn't sit well with him. His face turned red, but before he could yell something about how I needed the discipline or whatever nonsense excuse he always used, Sharon chimed in. "You think you're so smart now because you bought yourself a little house," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But let's be real. This is all just luck. And you're forgetting who your family is." "Luck?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the 12-hour shifts, the skipped vacations, and the years of saving pennies?" "Yeah, you're right. All luck." "Don't get smart with me," Sharon shot back, narrowing her eyes. "You wouldn't even have the opportunities you do if it weren't for us." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "For you? What opportunities, Sharon? The one where you packed me off to school at 8 so you wouldn't have to deal with me? Or the one where you pretended I didn't exist unless it was Christmas or you needed something?" "That's not the point," my dad snapped, stepping back into the conversation. "We're not here to talk about the past. We're here to talk about what matters now. Brittany's situation matters now." I sighed, already feeling the headache form. "All right, fine. What's going on with Brittany?" "She's pregnant," Sharon said bluntly, her arms crossed like this was somehow my fault. "Okay," I said slowly, looking at Brittany, who was sitting there looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Congratulations, I guess?" Before I could say anything else, Brittany started sobbing. Then my dad jumped in. "The father's gone, all right? She's in this alone, and she needs help, real help, not just lip service." I looked between them, waiting for the ask. There's always an ask. "And by real help, you mean money?" "You're giving her the house," Sharon said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. That took a second to sink in. "I'm sorry. What now?" "The house," Sharon repeated, leaning forward. "You've got 3 bedrooms, don't you? What do you need all that space for? You're single, no kids, always at work. Meanwhile, Brittany has a baby on the way and no place to live. It's common sense." "Common sense?" I said, staring at her like she'd just suggested I sell my kidney for fun. "You think it's common sense for me to just hand over my house? The one I worked years to afford? That house? You're being selfish," my dad said, his tone sharp. "You think just because you worked for something, you don't owe your family anything? This is blood we're talking about. Family takes care of family." "Oh, like you took care of me when I was a kid?" I shot back. "Yeah, let's talk about family. You weren't there for me in any stage of my life since I was young. Never came to a single soccer game. Never called unless it was Christmas or you needed something. But now I'm supposed to hand over my house because we're family? Give me a break." My dad's jaw clenched. He hated when I threw the past in his face, but it was the truth, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "This isn't about you," Sharon said, her voice rising. "It's about Brittany and that baby. Are you really going to let them struggle just so you can keep living in your precious house?" "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my tone calm despite the irritation bubbling under the surface. "But no, I'm not giving up my house. I'm happy to help in other ways. Financially, maybe even letting her stay in one of the spare rooms for a bit. But giving her the whole house? That's not happening." "You don't care about me or the baby," Brittany finally spoke up, her voice trembling like she was about to cry. I looked at her, and for a second I felt bad. But then I remembered all the times she ignored me, the way she and Sharon always treated me like an outsider. It's not about not caring, Brittany. It's about boundary. I worked my butt off to get where I am, and I'm not going to throw it all away because you've decided you need my house more than I do. "You're just proving what we've always known," Sharon said. "You don't care about this family. You never have." I laughed again, shaking my head. "Right, because this family has been such a shining example of love and support. Spare me the lecture, Sharon. You've made it clear since day one that I don't belong here." "That's enough!" my dad barked, his voice loud enough to make even Sharon flinch. He pointed a finger at me. "You think you're better than us now? Is that it? Because you bought yourself a house? You're too good to help your sister? It's not about being better, I said, standing up. It's about the fact that I've built something for myself with no help from any of you. Not a dime, not a word of encouragement, nothing. So no, I'm not handing over my house. Find another solution. Brittany started crying for real this time, and Sharon glared at me like I just insulted her entire existence. My dad looked like he was gearing up for another round, but I wasn't sticking around for it. I think we're done here, I said, grabbing my key. Good luck with everything. As I walked out, I could hear Sharon muttering about how I'd regret this. Maybe I would, but as I drove home, all I felt was relief and a sinking feeling that this wasn't the last I'd hear about it. Of course, I was right. The fallout started the very next day. My phone didn't stop buzzing. Calls, texts, voicemails, each one more ridiculous than the last. My dad kicked things off with his usual routine, accusing me of being heartless and selfish. He rambled about how I'd forgotten my roots and was disrespecting the people who made me. A real classic from the man who spent most of my childhood conveniently forgetting I exist. Sharon wasn't far behind. Her messages had less guilt and more venom. She flat out called me a failure as a son and accused me of deliberately trying to ruin Brittany's life. According to her, my refusal to hand over my house was proof that I never understood what family meant. I'm not sure what version of family she's working with, but it clearly doesn't involve boundaries. The extended family wasn't much better. Word got out fast, thanks to Sharon, no doubt. And suddenly I had aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years chiming in. They all had opinions, of course. Why would you not help your own family? One cousin wrote, conveniently ignoring the fact that this family has always treated me like an afterthought. The guilt parade reached its peak when Sharon decided to help me understand their point of view. She sent me an email with a list of apartment rentals, complete with prices and location. Each one was smaller, cheaper, and farther away from my work. Her message was clear. I should downgrade my life so Brittany could take over my house. She even included a note about how I could easily afford one of these places while continuing to pay for the house Brittany would live in. I didn't respond. What was the point? They weren't interested in having a conversation. They just wanted me to cave. But when it became clear that guilt and manipulation weren't working, things escalated. I came home one evening to find the lock on my front door jammed. At first, I thought it was a fluke. Maybe something got stuck. But then I noticed the scratches around the keyhole like someone had been messing with it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had a sinking feeling I knew who was behind it. Sure enough, when I checked the security camera I'd installed a few months back, there she was, Sharon, fiddling with my lock in broad daylight like a jerk. The audacity was unreal. Not only had she decided to break into my house, but she hadn't even tried to be subtle about it. She walked right up, looked around like she owned the place, and went to work. I called a locksmith to fix the lock and installed an additional security camera, this time pointing directly at the driveway. I didn't say anything to Sharon or my dad, because honestly, I wanted to see how far they'd take this. It didn't take long to find out. A few days later, I came home to find the front yard trashed. The garden I'd been working on was destroyed. Plants ripped out, dirt scattered everywhere. Someone had thrown garbage across the lawn, and there were dents in the mailbox like someone had taken a bat to it. At this point, I was beyond livid. I checked the security footage and, surprise, it was Sharon again. This time she'd brought Brittany along for the ride. The two of them spent a good 20 minutes wrecking the yard, laughing and taking pictures like they were at a party. I'd had enough. I called the police and filed a report. They took statements, reviewed the footage, and told me they'd follow up. Sharon and Brittany must have realized they'd gone too far, because I didn't hear from them directly for a couple of days. Instead, my dad took over. He called, furious, saying I'd humiliated the family by involving the police. Apparently, I was supposed to just sit back and let them destroy my property because family handles things privately. Sure, Dad, because handling things privately has worked out so well in the past. The next week was a nightmare. Every time I thought it was over, they found a new way to make my life difficult. Sharon sent me more texts, this time demanding an apology and threatening to sue me for emotional distress. Brittany posted vague messages online about how I was a toxic family member who had turned his back on a pregnant woman in need. But the final straw came when I got a call from my boss. Someone had emailed him anonymously, claiming I was unstable and engaging in illegal activities. The email was full of lies, completely baseless, but it was enough to cause an awkward conversation at work. I knew exactly who was behind it. Sharon and Brittany had officially crossed every line. That evening, I drove home, my mind racing with anger and frustration. I'd done everything I could to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, and to make it clear that I wasn't going to be bullied. But clearly, they weren't getting the message. As I pulled into my driveway, I spotted a piece of paper taped to the door. It was a handwritten note from my dad, saying we needed to talk. Of course we did. I crumpled the note in my hand and went inside. already dreading whatever fresh nonsense was waiting for me. The crumpled note from my dad sat in my hand like a ticking time bomb. As much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew I couldn't. Cutting them off had been liberating, but the things had already escalated to vandalism and harassment, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I needed to confront my dad face to face, get some answers, and make it crystal clear where I stood. The next morning, I drove to their house. The driveway was cluttered with Sharon's usual mess: plastic flamingos, wind chimes, and some dying potted plants she probably forgot to water. I parked and walked up to the door, not even bothering to knock. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantry. My dad was sitting in the living room, flipping through the TV channels. When he saw me, he smirked, like he'd been expecting me to show up eventually. Sharon wasn't in sight, which was probably for the best. "You got something to say?" I asked as I stood in the doorway. He set the remote down and leaned back in his chair. "So, you finally decided to stop ignoring your family?" I let out a dry laugh. "Family? I'm fed with that nonsense, because from where I'm standing, family doesn't trash someone's yard or try to break into their house." His smirk faltered, but he didn't look surprised. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "I have security footage. I saw Sharon and Brittany messing with my locks and destroying my garden. Don't even try to deny it." For a moment, he just stared at me, like he was trying to figure out how to spin it. Finally, he shrugged. "Sharon was just trying to get you to see reason. You've been so stubborn lately, ignoring what's best for the family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What's best for the family?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think breaking into my house and vandalizing my property is what's best for the family? That's insane." He stood up, trying to look imposing, but I didn't back down. "You're overreacting. Sharon and Brittany just wanted you to understand how serious this is. You've been acting like you're too good for us, like you don't care about your sister's situation." "Oh, I care," I said, stepping closer. "I care enough to tell you that if either of them shows up at my house again, I'm pressing charges. No warnings, no second chances. Do you understand me?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're really going to call the cops on your own family?" "I already did," I said bluntly, "and I'll do it again. You think I'm joking? Try me." The room went quiet. For once, my dad didn't have a snarky response. He just sat back down, muttering something under his breath about how I was being unreasonable. I didn't stick around to argue. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't about to waste more time trying to convince him I was in the right. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. For a couple of days, things were quiet. No calls, no emails, no surprise visit. I started to think maybe my warning had actually worked. Maybe for once they'd gotten the message. I told myself that my dad's silence meant he'd finally accepted that I wasn't going to play along with their games anymore. What is really bothering me now is that I cannot have a peace of mind. I still have the feeling that this isn't going to stop. I know them. They'll keep escalating, keep finding new ways to try and wear me down. I've already dealt with vandalism, manipulation, and their endless attempts to guilt trip me. What's next? Showing up at my work? Dragging me more to Brittany's mess? So yeah, I could really use some advice here. What am I supposed to do? Cutting them off obviously hasn't done anything, and honestly, I'm starting to think it never will. Do I keep standing my ground? Do I go nuclear and take more drastic steps? Part of me is even thinking about selling the house and moving somewhere they can't find me. But would that just be giving them exactly what they want? I don't know anymore. I just want this whole mess to be over. Final update. Hey guys, so here's an update. A lot has happened since my last post, and I don't even know where to start. Let's just say things took a turn I wasn't expecting. Or maybe I should have, given how my family operates. It all went down late one evening. I was sitting at home, finally enjoying some peace and quiet after cutting ties with my dad, Sharon, and Brittany. For a few blissful days, there had been no calls, no emails, and no random passive-aggressive messages from extended family. It was starting to feel like I'd made the right choice. Then, I heard shouting. At first, I thought it was just the usual neighborhood noise, someone arguing with a neighbor or a couple of teens being loud. But the yelling got louder and closer, and that's when I realized it was coming from right outside my house. I peeked out the window and saw a guy pacing on my lawn, shouting to himself like an angry dog looking for a fight. He was gesturing wildly, his voice getting angrier by the second. I opened the door cautiously, keeping it cracked. "Can I help you?" I asked, my heart already racing. "You're the guy, aren't you?" he barked, pointing a finger at me like he'd found the villain in a crime drama. "The one messing with Brittany?" My stomach dropped. Of course it was about Brittany. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, stepping closer to the door. "She told me everything. Said you've been screwing her over, backing out of deals, ruining her life. You think you can just do that and get away with it?" I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. Brittany had apparently dragged one of her clients into her vendetta against me. This guy looked furious, but more than that, he looked unstable. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have nothing to do with Brittany. Whatever she told you, it's a lie. Now, I suggest you leave." "Bullshit!" he snapped, stepping onto the porch like he was daring me to do something. "You're not getting rid of me that easy." At that point, I slammed the door and locked it. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't believe what was happening. This random guy, someone I'd never met in my life, was pounding on my door, shouting threats, and demanding I come out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation as quickly as I could. Every second felt like an hour as I waited for them to arrive. Meanwhile, the guy kept banging on the door, yelling things I couldn't even make sense of. For a moment, I honestly thought he was going to try and break in. Finally, I heard the sweet sound of sirens in the distance, and the shouting stopped. The police pulled up, and the guy backed off, but he didn't go quietly. He was still ranting about how I'd ruined everything for Brittany as the officers cuffed him and led him away. The cops took my statement and reviewed the security footage I'd installed after Sharon and Brittany had trashed my yard. They assured me they'd handle it, but the whole situation left me feel unsafe. As I stood in the doorway, looking out at my now quiet street, I realized something. My house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a target. The next morning, I called my real estate agent. "I'm selling," I told her. She didn't ask why. She just said she'd come by later that day to start the process. Over the next few weeks, I packed up my things and finalized the sale. The market was decent, and I managed to get a fair price for the house. But at that point, I didn't care about the money. I just wanted out. I found a small apartment in a quiet town a few hours away. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful, and that's all I needed. No nosy neighbors, no late-night shouting matches, no unhinged people pounding on my door. Just peace and quiet. Moving day was bittersweet. As I loaded the last box into my car, I took one last look at the house. It had been my dream once, a symbol of everything I'd worked for. But now it was just a reminder of all the drama I wanted to leave behind. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I'm finally free. Free from the guilt, the manipulation, the endless demands. Sometimes cutting ties isn't enough. Sometimes you have to walk away completely, burn the bridge, and start fresh. That's exactly what I did. Now I'm settling into my new place, and for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. No calls, no texts, no drama, just me, my quiet apartment, and the freedom to live my life on my terms. So, yeah, that's the update. It's been a wild ride, but I finally feel like I'm in a good place. Thanks to everyone who encouraged me to stand my ground and take control of my life. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Here's to new beginnings.